The briefing room fell silent when Commander HFY walked in, his scales shimmering under the cold lights of the orbital station. And every cadet in the room could feel that something was wrong, that this year's training would be different from anything they had prepared, for the commander was a Volrani, tall and covered in dark green scales, with 4 arms that he kept folded behind his back as he studied the young soldiers before him. And when he spoke, his voice was like gravel scraping against metal. Cadets, the Galactic Union faces a threat unlike any in the past 300 years, he began, his yellow eyes moving across the room. The hegemony is expanding, and war is no longer a possibility but a certainty, and because of this, your survival assessment has been upgraded. A nervous murmur rippled through the assembled cadets. And Eurylex, a tall insectoid Kovati with compound eyes that reflected the room in 1,000 tiny images, felt his mandibles click together in anxiety as he waited for the commander to continue. You will be dropped onto Vareth 7 for 72 standard hours, HFY said. And the room erupted into whispers and gasps. Vareth 7 was a Class 3 death world, and everyone knew what that meant. Toxic atmosphere that required filtered masks at all times. Apex predators that could tear through standard armor like paper. Plants that would eat you if you stood still too long. Temperature swings that could freeze you at night and cook you by day. And ground that might open up beneath your feet without warning. A small mammalian cadet named Plix began to shake so badly that his fur stood on end. And next to him, Thyssen, an amphibian with smooth blue skin and large dark eyes, looked like he might pass out from fear, but in the middle of the crowd stood someone who was not shaking at all. And Eurylex noticed her immediately because she was the only one in the room who seemed completely calm. Her name was Sergeant Mira Chun, and she was a human, the first of her kind to attend the Galactic Union Military Academy as an exchange officer. And she was reading the briefing packet about Vareth 7 with the same expression someone might have while reading a restaurant menu. Eurylex moved closer to her, his long legs carrying him through the crowd until he stood beside the human female. And he lowered his head to speak quietly. "Are you not frightened?" he asked, his translator turning his clicking speech into words she could understand. Mira looked up from her packet and smiled. And Eurylex noticed that humans showed their teeth when they were happy, which was disturbing because most species only showed teeth as a threat. "Frightened of what?" she asked, tilting her head toward the holographic display showing Vareth 7's deadly landscape, the Death World. Eurylex said, certain that she had somehow missed the announcement. "We are being sent to a Class 3 Death World for 3 days with minimal equipment." Mira looked at the display again, studying the massive predators and carnivorous plants and toxic swamps. And then she shrugged in that strange way humans did, lifting her shoulders and letting them fall. "Reminds me of camping trips back home," she said. "Well, maybe a bit milder, actually." Eurylex was certain she was joking, using humor to hide her fear the way some species did when facing death. So he did not push the matter further. Commander HFY began assigning cadets to fire teams of 5, and fate or perhaps cruel design placed Eurylex with the human, along with Thyssen the amphibian, Coradin, a large reptilian female with thick scales and an aggressive temper, and little Plix, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his own fur. "Fire Team 7, HFY announced, looking at Mira with something like curiosity in his ancient eyes. "You have been assigned the Southern Valley Drop Zone, and may the stars watch over you." The cadets were given 1 hour to prepare, and in that hour, Eurylex watched Mira with growing fascination as she moved through the equipment bay with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She checked her filter mask 3 times, tested the seal, adjusted the straps until they fit perfectly. And then she helped Plix with his own mask when the small cadet's trembling hands could not manage the clasps. "Hey, little guy," she said, kneeling down to his level. "You're going to be okay. You know that, right?" Plix looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes and shook his head. "I am going to die," he whispered. "We are all going to die on that world," Myra laughed. And it was a warm sound, not mocking but genuinely amused. And she put a hand on Plix's shoulder. "Nobody's dying on my watch," she said. "I've survived worse than this. Trust me." Corradin snorted from across the room, her reptilian snout wrinkling with skepticism. "You have survived worse than a Class 3 death world?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "What could possibly be worse?" Myra stood up and turned to face the larger female. And even though Corradin towered over her by nearly a full meter, the human did not seem intimidated at all. "Ever heard of Earth?" Myra asked. Corradin shook her head. And neither did the others, because Earth was a small planet on the edge of explored space, barely known to the wider galaxy. "It's my home," Myra said, picking up her pack and slinging it over her shoulder. "And compared to some places on Earth, Vareth 7 looks like a resort." The drop pods were small and cramped, designed to deliver cadets to the surface quickly and with minimal chance of interception. And as Fireteam 7 strapped themselves into their seats, Rilix felt his hearts beating faster than they ever had before. Thiessen was praying quietly in his native tongue, asking his water gods for protection, and Corradin was gripping her seat restraints so hard that her claws had punctured the material. And Plix had his eyes squeezed shut and was whimpering softly. Only Myra seemed relaxed, leaning back in her seat with her eyes closed, and when Rilix looked at her, he could have sworn she was smiling. The countdown began, and with each number, the reality of what they were about to face became more and more real. And when the pod finally launched, dropping them toward the deadly world below, Rilix heard something that made no sense to him at all. Myra was humming. The pod screamed through the atmosphere, shaking and rattling as heat built up around them, and warning lights flashed and alarms blared. And still the human hummed a soft tune that Rilix did not recognize. They hit the ground hard, the impact dampeners absorbing most of the shock, but still leaving them rattled and bruised. And for a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. As they listened to the sounds of Vareth 7 outside their pod, something roared in the distance, a sound so deep and powerful that it vibrated through the metal walls. And Plix began to cry. The hatch opened with a hiss, and warm, toxic air flooded in, immediately filtered by their masks, and through the opening, they could see the valley they had landed in, a nightmare landscape of bioluminescent plants and twisted trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Mira was the first one out, stepping onto the alien soil and looking around with an expression of pure interest, like a tourist arriving at a new destination. And she took a deep breath through her filter and smiled. "All right, team," she said, turning back to face her terrified companions. "Let's find high ground before dark, and try to keep up." She started walking toward the jungle without waiting for a response. And one by one, the others followed, because even though they barely knew this human, she was the only one among them who seemed to have any idea what she was doing. Rilix took one last look at the drop pod, their only connection to safety and civilization, and then he followed his team into the deadly wilderness of Vareth 7, wondering if any of them would live to see the extraction shovel behind them. Something in the jungle began to follow. The jungle of Vareth 7 was nothing like the forests of any civilized world, and as Fireteam 7 pushed through the dense undergrowth, every shadow seemed to hide something hungry, and every sound seemed to promise death. Myra walked at the front of the group, moving with a strange grace that the others could not match, and she seemed to notice things that were invisible to everyone else, stopping suddenly to examine a broken branch or kneeling to look at marks in the soil. Thiessen was struggling badly, his amphibian skin designed for humid environments and already showing signs of stress from the dry, toxic air. And Plix stayed so close to Myra that he nearly tripped her twice. And Corridin kept reaching for the plasma cutter at her belt like she wanted to fight something. Anything, just to release the tension building inside her. "We need to move faster," Corridin growled, her reptilian eyes scanning the trees around them. "Something is following us." "I can feel it. Something is always following you on the Death World," Myra said, without turning around. "The trick is making sure it decides you're not worth the trouble." She stopped suddenly and held up her hand. And everyone froze, and for a terrible moment, the only sound was their own breathing through their masks. Corridin looked around frantically, trying to see what had alarmed the human, but there was nothing visible. Just more twisted plants and bioluminescent fungi and shadows. "What is it?" Eurylex whispered. Mira pointed at the ground ahead of them, at what looked like an ordinary patch of moss-covered soil. And she picked up a stick and tossed it onto the patch. The ground exploded upward as something massive and covered in spines burst from beneath the surface. Jaws snapping shut on empty air where the stick had been, and then the creature sank back down, disappearing beneath the soil like it had never been there at all. "Ambush predator," Mira said calmly. "Already looking for another path. They sense vibrations, so we go around. Step where I step." She led them in a wide arc around the hidden predator, testing the ground with her stick before each step. And nobody complained about her pace anymore as they climbed higher into the hills. Mira did things that confused and amazed her teammates in equal measure. And Eurylex watched her with his compound eyes, recording everything for later analysis. She tasted the soil at one point, actually putting a small amount on her tongue and spitting it out. And when Thiessen asked her what she was doing, she explained that the acidity of the soil told her which direction water flowed. She found animal droppings and examined them closely, determining from their composition that they came from a herbivore, which meant there was a prey population in the area, which meant predators hunted here regularly. She listened to distant roars that made everyone else flinch and nodded like they were telling her something useful, explaining that the calls were territorial markers and that they could navigate safely by staying between the territories. "How do you know all this?" Thiessen asked, his voice filled with wonder. None of this was in the cadet training manuals. Myra smiled and kept walking. And for a moment, she did not answer. And when she finally spoke, her voice was strange, almost nostalgic. "Earth," she said simply. "My planet has places just like this. And humans have been surviving in them for thousands of years. And we learned to read the land because those who could not read it did not live long enough to have children." They found a cave as the light began to fade, a small opening in a rocky hillside that Mira declared defensible. And she immediately began organizing their camp with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. She assigned watch rotations, putting herself on the longest and most dangerous shift in the deep night hours. And she showed them how to build a simple alarm system using vines and loose rocks that would rattle if anything tried to enter the cage. Identified plants near the entrance, pointing out which ones were toxic and which ones might be safe to eat if their rations ran out. And she found a small spring of water that she tested carefully before declaring it safe to drink after filtration. "We should build a fire," Corridin said, "for warmth and to keep predators away. Fire attracts as much as it repels." Myra replied, "But you're right that we need one. Just keep it small and inside the cave where the light won't carry far." Night fell on Verith 7 like a curtain dropping, sudden and complete. And the jungle that had seemed dangerous during the day became absolutely terrifying in the darkness. The bioluminescent plants glowed with sickly colors, greens and blues and purples, that painted the landscape in nightmare shades. And the sounds of the night hunters filled the air. Screams and roars and crashes as massive creatures moved through the trees. Something large came to investigate their cave, drawn by the smell of alien life and when it appeared at the entrance, everyone except Mira stopped breathing. It was a Vareth stalker, standing nearly 3 meters tall on 6 powerful legs. Its body covered in armor plates, and its head dominated by a mouthful of teeth designed for crushing bone. And its 4 eyes glowed red in the firelight as it studied the small creatures huddled in the cave. Plix fainted, and Thiessen looked like he wished he could do the same. And Corridin raised the plasma cutter with shaking hands. Knowing it would not be enough to stop this monster, Mira stood up. She picked up a burning branch from their small fire and walked toward the creature. And everyone wanted to scream at her to stop, but their voices would not work. And they watched in frozen horror as the small human approached the apex predator. She made herself big, raising the torch above her head and spreading her other arm wide. And she shouted at the creature, not words but sounds. Loud and aggressive and utterly fearless, the Vareth stalker hesitated, and in that moment of confusion, it made a calculation that predators had been making since the first hunter met the first prey that refused to run. And it decided that this small creature was not worth the risk. It turned and disappeared into the darkness. And Mira walked calmly back to the fire and sat down like nothing had happened. Predators prefer easy meals, she explained to her stunned teammates. If you don't act like prey, most of them won't treat you like it. And that one will remember us now. Remember that we're not afraid. And it will hunt easier targets instead. Nobody could sleep after that. Nobody except Myra, who took her watch shift and then curled up near the fire and fell asleep within minutes. Her breathing slow and peaceful while the sounds of death filled the jungle outside. Irilex stayed awake all night, watching the humans sleep, and he found himself thinking about what she had said about Earth. About a planet that had places like this and people who had learned to survive them. He had always thought of humans as one of the younger species in the galaxy. Newcomers who had only recently discovered faster than light travel and joined a wider community of civilized beings. But watching Myra face down a Vareth stalker with nothing but fire and fearlessness made him wonder if he had misunderstood something fundamental about her kind. Dawn came slowly on Vareth 7, the toxic sky lightening from black to a sickly orange. And Mira woke up refreshed and ready to move while everyone else felt like they had aged 10 years in a single night. "All right, team," she said, checking her equipment and helping Plix to his feet. 12 kilometers to the extraction point, and we've got 2 days to get there. So let's move. She walked out of the cave and into the deadly morning light. And once again, the others followed, because she was the only reason any of them were still alive. And they were beginning to understand that following her might be the only way to stay that way. The morning brought bad news from the orbital station. A crackling transmission on their emergency communicators, informing all surviving teams that 3 fire teams had already triggered their emergency beacons and been extracted as failures. Their members alive, but their military careers effectively over. Even worse, the station was tracking heavy predator movement across the region. Multiple packs of Vareth stalkers converging on areas where cadets had been detected. And something about the off-world scent, or the technology they carried, was drawing attention like blood in water. "We need to reach the plateau," Myra said, studying the crude map on her datapad. 12 kilometers through that jungle, and we have 2 days. But I want to be there by tonight if possible. "Impossible," Corridin said, her reptilian face twisted in frustration. "We barely covered 3 kilometers yesterday, and that was before the predators started actively hunting us." Mira looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but close to one, and there was something in her eyes that Rilex had not seen before. Something that looked almost like excitement. "Then we'll have to move smarter," she said. "Stay close, step where I step, and do exactly what I say when I say it. And we might just make it." The journey that followed was a nightmare for everyone except the human who led them. And Urelix found himself wondering if Mira was even the same species as the rest of them, because she seemed to belong to this death world in a way that made no sense. They came to a river first, a wide stretch of dark water that blocked their path. And when Thiessen moved toward it eagerly, desperate to soak his dry, cracking skin, Mira grabbed him and pulled him back. "Look at the water," she said. Pointing at the surface at first, Urelix saw nothing. But then he noticed the tiny ripples, thousands of them, moving against the current. And he realized with horror that the water was full of something alive. Something small but numerous enough to turn the river into a living mass. "Parasites," Myra explained. "They'll burrow through your skin and eat you from the inside out. And I've seen things like them on Earth, so we're not swimming across. Instead," she led them upstream until they found a fallen tree bridging the gap. And she tested it carefully before leading them across one at a time, balanced above the deadly water on a log that creaked and shifted with every step past the river. They entered a field of strange mushroom-like growths, beautiful things with caps that shimmered in the dim light. And Plix actually reached out to touch one before Myra slapped his hand away. "Pressure sensitive," she said. "Touch one and it explodes with toxic spores. Touch enough of them and the chain reaction will kill everything within 50 meters. She found a path through the deadly garden by throwing rocks ahead of them, triggering the explosive fungi from a safe distance and waiting for the spore clouds to settle before moving forward. A process that took an hour but kept them alive, and then the stalking began. Urelix noticed it first, his compound eyes catching movement in multiple directions at once. And he counted 8 shapes moving through the trees parallel to their path. 8 Vervirith stalkers working together in a coordinated pack. "We're being hunted," he said. Trying to keep his voice calm and failing Completelli, Corridin drew the plasma cutter, her claws extending as her body prepared for a fight she knew she could not win. And Thiessen began to shake so badly that he could barely walk, but Mira just nodded, like this was exactly what she had expected. And she began to do something that made no sense to any of them. She pulled off her outer jacket and rubbed it against trees as they passed, leaving their scent on the bark. And then she led the team in a wide loop that took them away from their path and then back again, doubling over their own trail. "What are you doing?" Urelix asked, his anxiety growing as the predators continued to shadow them, confusing the trail. Myra said, "Making them think there are more of us than there are. Making them uncertain about which direction we went. And buying us time. It worked, or at least it seemed to work, because the pack hesitated at the point where the trails crossed. And by the time they sorted out the confusion, Fireteam 7 had gained enough distance to lose them in the dense jungle. They stopped to rest in a small clearing, everyone except Myra collapsing from exhaustion and terror. And it was there that Urelix finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the assessment began. "You are not afraid," he said, watching the human drink water and check her equipment like they were on a training exercise instead of a death world. "You have not been afraid since we arrived, and I need to understand why." Myra was quiet for a moment, looking at the alien jungle around them. And when she spoke, her voice was different, softer and more thoughtful than Urelix had heard before. "I'm going to tell you something that most species in the galaxy don't know," she said. "Something that humans don't really talk about because we didn't realize it was unusual until we met other intelligent life." She sat down on a fallen log and looked at each of her teammates in turn. And even Corridin stopped her aggressive pacing to listen. "Earth is a death world," Myra said. "By Galactic Union standards, it's a Class 4. Maybe Class 5 in some regions. And humans evolved there, survived there, for 200,000 years before we ever built a spaceship." The others stared at her in shock, because Class 4 death worlds were supposed to be uninhabitable. places where a life could exist but intelligent life could never develop. And the idea that an entire species had evolved on such a world was almost impossible to believe. "We have everything Earth 7 has," Myra continued. "And more. We have hurricanes that flatten cities, earthquakes that swallow towns, volcanoes that bury civilizations, predators that can kill with a single bite, plants that poison, insects that spread disease, and a sun that slowly gives us cancer if we stay in its light too long." She smiled. And this time there was pride in her expression. Pride in something else that Rilix could only describe as love. We survived by becoming the most adaptable, persistent, creative species on our planet. We learned to read the environment, to predict danger, to work together, to never give up no matter how bad things got. And by the time we killed our last mega predator, we had become the most dangerous thing on Earth. Corridin made a sound that might have been disbelief, but her eyes were wide and her aggressive posture had softened. "You were saying your people are evolved for this?" she asked. "For survival in deadly environments, not just evolved," Myra said, standing up and looking toward their destination. "Built for it. Shaped by millions of years of struggle against a world that tried to kill us every single day. And this place, Vareth 7, with its predators and its toxic air and its deadly plants. This is what we were made for." She took a deep breath, and Urilex saw something change in her face. Something that looked almost like joy. "You asked if I'm afraid," she said, looking at Rilix with eyes that held no fear at all. "The truth is, I feel more alive here than I have since I left home. And that probably makes me crazy by your standards. But it's the truth." She started walking again, toward the plateau that was now visible in the distance. A rocky mass rising above the jungle canopy, and one by one, her team followed her. They had 12 kilometers to cover when they started that morning. And by the time the second night began to fall, they had covered 11 of them, moving faster than should have been possible through terrain that should have killed them a dozen times over. But the last kilometer was a cliff face rising straight up into the sky. And as they stood at its base, looking up at the impossible climb before them, the sky began to darken with more than just nightfall. A storm was coming. A massive wall of clouds lit by constant lightning. And the wind was already beginning to howl through the valley behind them. "We have to climb," Myra said. "Now, before the storm hits. Or we'll be trapped down here with whatever else is trying to escape the weather." She started up the cliff without waiting for agreement, her hands finding holds that the others could barely see, and behind her, her team began to climb, driven by fear and exhaustion and a desperate trust in the human who had kept them alive this long above them. The storm raced toward the plateau, and below them, the jungle began to scream with the voices of predators seeking shelter, and Mira climbed. Because that was what humans did. They climbed toward impossible goals through impossible obstacles. And they did not stop until they reached the top or died trying. The cliff face was 100 meters of slick rock and crumbling handholds. And the storm was coming faster than anyone had expected, turning the sky into a wall of black clouds split by constant lightning. And Mira climbed like she had been born for this. "Watch where I put my hands," she called down to her team, her voice somehow carrying over the growing wind. "The rock is solid here but loose in patches. So test every hold before you trust it." Rilix climbed behind her, his multiple limbs giving him an advantage on the rock face, and he tried to guide the others, calling out warnings when he saw dangerous sections and encouragement when they began to falter. Thason was struggling the most, his amphibian body not designed for climbing, his smooth skin unable to grip the rough stone the way the others could. And twice he slipped and nearly fell before Corridin, climbing below him, pushed him back against the rock with a grunt of effort. Plix was crying as he climbed, small whimpers of terror escaping through his mask. But he did not stop, did not give up. Because giving up meant death, and he was too afraid to die. The storm hit when they were halfway up. And suddenly, the world became chaos. Rain hammered down so hard, it felt like being beaten. And the wind tried to tear them from the rock with every gust. And lightning struck the cliff above them with a crack that left everyone temporarily deaf. And still they climbed, because there was no other choice. "Keep moving," Mira shouted. And her voice was the only thing holding the team together. "Don't look down. Don't think about the storm. Just focus on the next handhold and keep moving." They were 3/4 of the way up when Thiessen finally lost his grip. His hands slipped on the wet rock, and his feet could find no purchase, and he began to fall backward into the screaming void below. His mouth open in a scream that was lost in the thunder. Myra moved faster than Rilix would have believed possible, lunging sideways across the rock face with one hand still gripping her hold. And she caught Fassan's arm with her free hand, stopping his fall with a jerk that nearly pulled them both off the cliff for 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. Mira held Thiessen's entire weight with one hand while her other hand and her feet kept them both attached to the cliff. And her muscles screamed in protest, and her fingers began to bleed from the rough stone cutting into her skin. But she did not let go. Rilix reached them first, grabbing Thiessen and pulling him back against the rock, finding holds for his feet and guiding his hands to solid stone. And only then did Myra release her grip. "How?" Thiessen gasped, his entire body shaking from more than just the cold. "How did you hold me? Humans have incredible grip strength for our size," Myra said, flexing her bleeding hand and wincing. "We evolved from tree-dwelling ancestors, spent millions of years swinging through branches, and our bodies never forgot how to hold on." They reached the top as the storm reached its peak, pulling themselves over the edge onto the flat surface of the plateau and collapsing in the rain and wind. Too exhausted to move another step, but there was no shelter on the plateau. Nothing but flat rock and sparse vegetation. Nowhere to hide from the storm that was trying its best to kill them. "Huddle together," Mira ordered, pulling her team into a tight group with Plix and Thiessen in the center, where they would be most protected from the wind and cold. "Share body heat and wait it out," they pressed together. 5 beings from 5 different worlds, clinging to each other on a plateau, on a death world, while lightning split the sky, and rain tried to drown them, and wind tried to freeze them. And somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, Mira began to talk. "Let me tell you about humans," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the storm. "Let me tell you about my people, and why I know we're going to survive this." The others listened because her voice was the only anchor they had in the madness. 50,000 years ago, a group of humans walked out of Africa, she said. They walked into lands they had never seen, with animals they had never hunted and plants they had never eaten. And they had nothing but stone tools and fire in each other. And they kept walking until they had spread across the entire planet. Lightning struck somewhere nearby, close enough to make Plix scream. But Mira kept talking. 20,000 years ago, humans followed herds of animals across a frozen bridge of ice into a new continent. And they walked from that frozen north all the way to the southern tip of that land, through jungles and deserts and mountains. And everywhere they went, they survived and thrived. The wind howled like something alive, something hungry. But the group stayed together, sharing warmth, sharing strength. 100 years ago, humans reached the South Pole of Earth, the coldest place on our planet, where temperatures drop so low that exposed skin freezes in seconds. And they did it with equipment that would make our gear look advanced. And they survived, and they came home. Thiessen had stopped shaking, whether from the shared warmth or from the distraction of Myra's voice. And even Cara Dinn was listening intently. "Humans believe something," Myra said. and her voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that seemed to push back against the storm itself. We believe that no matter how bad things get, someone might survive, and if someone might survive, then that someone might as well be you, so you keep going. One more step, one more breath, one more moment. Until you make it or you don't. The storm raged around them, but it could not touch what Mira was building with her words. A shelter made of stories and strength and stubborn human refusal to give up. I have read about a man who survived alone in the wilderness for over a month with a broken leg, she said. I have read about people who drifted in the ocean for weeks with no food or water. And I have read about explorers trapped in ice for years who finally walked home. And every single one of them survived because they refused to accept that they were going to die. She looked at each of her teammates in turn, meeting their eyes in the storm-lit darkness. We are going to survive this, she said. Not because we are the strongest or the fastest or the best equipped, but because we are going to keep going no matter what. And that is what survival is. That is what it has always been. And that is what humans have been doing since before we knew there were stars above us. Dawn came slowly, the storm fading to a drizzle and then to nothing. And when the first rays of the sick orange sun broke through the clouds, Fireteam 7 was still alive, still together, still huddled on the plateau waiting for the extraction that would come in just a few more hours. But as the light grew stronger, Rillick saw something that made his heart stop below them. Climbing up the same cliff face they had ascended the night before was a pack of Vareth stalkers. 6 massive predators moving up the rock with terrifying speed and coordination. And they were heading straight for the plateau. Myra, Rillick said, unable to keep the despair from his voice. We have company. Myra stood up, her body battered and exhausted, but her eyes still bright with that strange human fire. And she looked down at the approaching predators with an expression that Rillick could not read. And I guess we're not done yet, she said. And she began to walk toward the edge of the plateau where the stalkers would emerge. The others tried to follow, tried to stand beside her, but she held up her hand. Stay behind me, she said. All of you stay behind me. And they did. Because she was Mira Chun, the human who had kept them alive through 2 days on a death world. And if she said to stay behind her, then that was where they would stay. The first stalker crested the plateau, its 4 red eyes finding Myra immediately, and it let out a roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. Myra did not move. She stood there, small and fragile compared to the monster before her, and she waited for what was about to happen next. 6 Vareth stalkers stood on the plateau now, each one 3 meters of armored muscle and teeth and hunger. And they formed a half-circle around the small group of cadets with the patience of apex predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. Coradin gripped the plasma cutter so hard that her claws left marks in the metal. And she knew with absolute certainty that even if she managed to kill one of the creatures, the other 5 would tear them apart in seconds. But she would not die without a fight. Plix had stopped crying, had stopped moving, had stopped doing anything except stare at the monsters with the empty acceptance of prey that knows its end has come. And Thiessen was whispering prayers to gods that could not hear him on this world. Rillick watched Myra, because in the past 2 days he had learned that watching the human was the best way to know what to do. And what he saw made no sense to him at all. She was calm, not pretending to be calm, not forcing herself to appear calm, but genuinely, completely calm, standing before 6 apex predators like she was waiting for a transport shuttle instead of facing death. The pack leader, the largest of the stalkers, stepped forward, its massive head lowering until its 4 eyes were almost level with Myra's face. And it opened its mouth in a display of teeth that could crush stone. And it roared so loudly that Rillick felt it in his bones. Myra did not flinch. She took a step forward, toward the predator, and she made eye contact with the pack leader, holding its gaze the way no prey animal ever would. And when she spoke, her voice was low and steady and absolutely fearless. "We are not prey." The stalker tilted its head, confused by this small creature that walked toward death instead of away from it. And the other members of the pack shifted uncertainly, their instincts telling them something was wrong, but unable to identify. What Mira bent down without breaking eye contact with the leader and picked up a rock from the ground. A sharp piece of stone that fit perfectly in her hand, and she held it where the stalkers could see it. "I know you don't understand my words," she said, her voice still that same calm, commanding tone. "But you understand this. You understand what I am. And I am not afraid of you." She threw the rock, not at the pack leader, but at a smaller stalker to the right, hitting it on the armored snout with a crack that echoed across the plateau. And the struck creature flinched back in surprise and pain. The pack leader snarled, outraged by this challenge to its authority, and it took another step toward Mira, close enough now that she could have reached out and touched its teeth. "I am a human," Mira said. And there was something ancient in her voice now, something that came from 200,000 years of survival on a death world. "My ancestors killed creatures bigger than you with pointed sticks. They domesticated wolves. They drove megafauna to extinction. They survived ice ages and supervolcanoes and each other." She picked up another rock. "We are not prey," she said again. "We are the most dangerous thing to ever evolve on our planet. And if you want to eat me, you are going to have to fight for it. And I promise you that whatever happens, it will not be easy." The pack leader stared at her, and Urilic saw something change in those 4 red eyes. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like the creature was seeing Mira clearly for the first time. Here was not prey. Here was a predator. The pack leader looked at Mira for a long moment. This small, soft creature that did not run, that did not smell of fear, that had challenged it without hesitation. And then it made a decision. It turned away one by one. The other stalkers followed, disappearing over the edge of the plateau and descending back down the cliff face, returning to the jungle below where there was easier prey and less confusing encounters. Mira stood still until the last stalker had vanished from sight. And then her shoulders dropped and she let out a long breath. And Urilic realized that she had been more afraid than she had shown. That the calm had been real, but not effortless. "Mira," he said, stepping forward on trembling legs. "How did you know that would work?" She turned to look at him, and there was exhaustion in her eyes, but also a smile on her face. "I didn't," she admitted. "But I knew that showing fear would definitely get us killed. And I knew that most predators don't want to fight. They want a meal. And there's a big difference between the two." The extraction shuttle arrived 20 minutes later, descending from the orange sky like a miracle made of metal and technology, and Commander HFY was aboard, his scales gleaming and his yellow eyes intense as he reviewed the data from the assessment of the 12 fire teams that had been dropped onto Varith 7. Only 2 had completed the assessment without triggering their emergency beacons, and one of those teams had done so by hiding in a cave for the entire 72 hours, barely surviving on their rations and emerging half-starved and traumatized. And then there was Fire Team 7 as Mira helped her teammates aboard the shuttle, supporting Thesson, whose legs barely worked, and carrying Plix, who had finally allowed himself to collapse now that safety was assured. Commander HFY approached her. "Sergeant Chun," he said, and there was something in his voice that Urilic had never heard before. Something like awe. "I have reviewed your biometric data from the assessment, and I must confess that I do not understand what I am seeing." Mira looked at him, too tired for formality, and simply waited for him to continue. "You crossed 12 kilometers of active hunting grounds," the commander said. "You survived 2 nights in the open on a Class 3 death world. You climbed a sheer cliff face during a Category 3 electrical storm, and you faced down a pack of apex predators without firing a single shot. He paused, his frills rippling with an emotion Myra could not identify. Throughout all of this, your stress hormones barely elevated above baseline. Your sleep cycles remained within normal parameters, and at one point during the first night, our sensors detected that you were humming. Myra shrugged. That strange human gesture that conveyed so much with so little. Respectfully, Commander, she said. It was practically a vacation. HFY stared at her for a long moment, and then he turned to his aide, a young Rai who was watching the human with wide eyes. Note for the Academy Council, the commander said, his voice firm and urgent. I am recommending that we immediately expand our exchange program with Earth. And I am suggesting that we make human recruitment a top priority for all military branches. The aide blinked in confusion. Sir, may I ask why? HFY looked at Myra, who was now helping her teammates strap in for the flight back to the orbital station, laughing at something Eurylex had said, treating the entire experience like it had been nothing more than an inconvenient training exercise. Because if war comes with the hegemony, the commander said quietly, I want as many humans as possible fighting on our side. The shuttle lifted off, rising through the toxic atmosphere of Vara 7, and Eurylex found a seat next to Myra. Settling his tired body into the cushions and letting out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 3 days. What you said down there, he began, about humans being the most dangerous thing on your world, about Earth being a death world. You were not exaggerating. Were you? Myra looked out the window as the death world shrank beneath them, and her expression was thoughtful. Relax. Humans hunted woolly mammoths with spears we made from sticks and stones. We tamed wolves and made them into loyal companions. We survived ice ages that lasted thousands of years. We crossed oceans in wooden boats without knowing if there was anything on the other side. And when we finally ran out of challenges on Earth, we started reaching for the stars. She turned to look at him, and there was something old and fierce in her eyes. The Galactic Union thinks we are the new species, the young ones. The ones who need protection and guidance and time to catch up with civilizations that have been in space for millennia. But they haven't figured it out yet. Figured out what? Eurylex asked mild. And it was not the predator smile she had shown the stalkers, but something gentler. Something that spoke of a species that had earned its place in the universe the hard way. We're not new to this, she said. We have been doing this for 200,000 years. Surviving the unsurvivable, adapting to the unadaptable, conquering the unconquerable, and the galaxy is just the next wilderness. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, ready to sleep for the first time since leaving the orbital station 3 days ago. Humanity didn't conquer Earth, she said softly. We survived it and everything we are. Our creativity, our endurance, our absolute refusal to accept defeat was forged in that survival below them. Vara 7 spun in silent menace, a Class 3 death world, a place where most species could barely survive for hours, a place that had broken 3/4 of the cadets who had been sent there, practically. Of the Eurylex watched the humans sleep, peaceful and calm despite everything they had been through. And he began to understand something that the rest of the galaxy would eventually learn as well. Humans were not the young species finding their way in a dangerous universe. They were the dangerous thing that the universe had not yet learned to fear, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Eurylex was very glad that they were on the same side.